Hello and welcome to Thyros Web Development Tips and Tutorials. Tailwind CSS released its major new version 3.0 on December 9th. If you're new to Tailwind or front-end development, you might wonder how to install and start working with this latest version of Tailwind CSS in simple projects that don't use any of the frameworks listed in the documentation here. There are so many ways to install, so it's quite confusing to choose between the available options. So in this video, I'll show you 3 ways and talk about when to use what. Option 1. Using the CDN link. This is the quickest. You only need one single file, one line, and customization is possible. All the latest options are available, but this is for development purposes only, and it's not recommended for production. Option 2. Using the Tailwind CLI. The CLI tool is the next quick option, very few steps and less number of issues. Option 3 is using PostCSS. Now this is the best option if you're using any build tools in your projects like Webpack, White or Parcel. So let's look at each of these methods in detail from installation to configuration, customization and production. Let's start by creating a new folder. Let's call it Tailwind CDN. CD into Tailwind CDN. And let's open this up in Visual Studio Code. Right, let's create a new file, index.html. And let's call this Tailwind CSS. Let's start by simply creating a div with width full, h screen, and maybe a bg purple 100. And once we include the Tailwind CDN link, we should be able to see a screen that has this purple 100 color. So let's go back to the documentation and copy this link right here. Paste it here, open this up in Live Server. And there you go. We do have a page with background color purple, which means Tailwind is working. That's great. Let me just put this up on the side of the editor. Now let me remove this purple background and add a gradient instead. So we say bg gradient to bottom right from purple 100 to pink 100 via cyan. Now earlier in versions that were below Tailwind 3.0, we didn't have this cyan color automatically included in the core. You had to configure it additionally. There were only few shades of Tailwind available, but now all the shades of Tailwind are available directly. So we do via cyan 100. And this just works. We have a beautiful gradient. Now let's add some content within. I have some content here. Let me just copy it and paste it. So now you notice I have added 2 classes, pros and pros LG. That is, I want to use the typography plugin which is the first party plugin of Tailwind CSS to make this look beautiful. For now, this will not work because we don't yet have the typography plugin included. But let me add a little padding first before we proceed. So let me add a P12. Yeah, that's good. Now we have the CDN link. How do we include plugins here? It's actually very simple. You can just add it directly to the link here with plugins equals the name of the plugin. So typography. Yes, there you go. You might have noticed some delay, and that's why using the CDN link in production is not recommended. There's one more thing you can do with CDN. You can directly make some changes in the browser and check if that's how you want things to work. Let me just expand this, and instead of pros LG, let me make it pros XL, And you see that works. So you can make changes directly in the browser with CDN, and once you're happy with the result, you can include them in your file. Let's close this and go back. You can additionally add whichever plugin you want here with a comma, say for example line clamp, and so on. You'll be able to use all of those plugins directly by including them in this link. Now let's see how you can add some configuration here. For that, you need to add a script and then say tailwind.config equals theme. Now this is actually available in the documentation. I don't know this by heart. So you can go here and yes, here it is. You can copy this or you can just look at it and paste it. Extend. Let's say you want to add a different color, a custom color of your own like Clifford. Let's add the same thing. Right, so let's say you need a custom color and then you'd like to use that here in the heading. So h1 class text Clifford. So you see the custom color is added. Similarly, you can add other custom values like height of your choice, a font size of your choice that's not available already in Tailwind utility classes. Now how about some custom CSS? You can do that with style tag, but instead of saying type text/CSS, you say text/Tailwind CSS. This should again be available in the documentation. So let's go down and yeah. So here it is. You'd like to add something, some custom class, you can do that here. Say for example, you want this whole background that we just added to be your primary background, right? So let me cut this and say bg primary, and within this, let's add a layer components. I say bg primary and then apply. Using the apply directive, I copy all those styles here and yes, it still works, right? Right, now let me change this color back because this is not looking that great. So I'll remove this and let me add a link here that says follow me on Twitter. Follow on Twitter. And then some styles to this. Horizontal padding px8, vertical padding py3, rounded md, bg, let's say blue or bg sky 600 for now. I'll change this later. Shadow md, and then text white, and maybe hover bg sky 700. Okay, let's add this within another div. Give it some margin top, so class mt12. Right, this looks fine now. Now obviously I don't want this sky 600 color, I want the actual Twitter color. So let me look up for the Twitter blue hex code. And there it is. Copy this. And for this is just a one-off thing, right? I want to use this color just once. I don't have any other button on my site. I would want this blue color. So it doesn't make sense to add this here in the configuration because I'm using it only once. And which is why we can use the arbitrary values feature here. And instead of sky 600, let me use square brackets and paste the color I just copied. So with the CDN, you can see you can also add arbitrary colors like this, and maybe a hover BG Sky 600 would still be fine. And if you haven't already read the docs or followed the Tailwind updates, the version 3.0 has a brilliant new feature where you can add colored shadows. So let's add a shadow of the same color. Copy this shadow, the same Twitter blue, but of course this is a little too bright. For that, let me just reduce the opacity and make it 40. This is how you do it. This is the shorthand way of doing it. And there you go. We have a nice blue shadow as well, which makes the button look a little more realistic. Great. So this is about using the CDN link if you quickly want to set up something and not worry about installing it, or you don't have NPM or multiple other reasons, you just want to try out Tailwind, then this is great, but you cannot use this for production. Now let's move on to our second way of installation by creating a new project again. So mkdir Tailwind CLI. This time we're using the Tailwind CLI way of installation. cd Tailwind CLI, and open this up in Visual Studio Code. The first thing we do here is again create an index.html file, but this time let's add it within a layouts folder just to keep things more organized, because we're going to have a lot of files coming in later. And within the layouts folder, I'll be creating the index.html. Let me first add the title, and let me copy whatever we did in the previous installation, so we will save some time. Right, so yeah, this is what we had. Now what we do is open the terminal within Visual Studio Code and go to our documentation to see how to install Tailwind using the CLI. So come to the first option here, and as you can see, this is the simplest and fastest way to get up and running with Tailwind CSS from scratch. So npm install -d Tailwind CSS. I'm assuming you already have npm, and if you're not sure, you can just check with npm-v. If you're able to see a number like this, you have npm installed. Otherwise, just look up on Google how to install npm. I already have npm installed, so let me do npm init-y to create a package.json file that will be required, and -y is the option I use for all the default values. And now you can see that you have the package.json file. Great. Now let's paste the line that we copied from the documentation, which is npm install -d Tailwind CSS. So we're installing the latest version of Tailwind CSS. And because we use the -d flag, we have Tailwind CSS installed within the dev dependencies, right? So you can look up and try and understand more about what these dev dependencies are. Great, we have that. Let's see what the next step is. The next step is to npx Tailwind CSS init. So let's do that. Let's execute this. And what this statement does is it creates your tailwind.config.js file. That is your configuration file. So yes, we have our default config file ready. Of course, you can say create new file and add all this code on your own, but that's not needed when you can do this with one single command, right? If you have used Tailwind version 2.2 or something like that previously, you might notice that this is a lot shorter than the previous configuration. We had something called purge, but that's changed to content now. And we also had variants here, but that's not required in the latest version. Great. Let's look at what the next step is. Now add the paths to all your template files in tailwind.config.js. What this means is in whichever files you have used all these Tailwind classes, you need to add the path to all those files in this config .js so that Tailwind knows which all files to scan the HTML for and extract those classes and add only those styles into your style sheet. So since we have only our index.html, we might add more HTML files within this layouts. Because of that, let's just add the layouts folder, layouts/star.html. That's all we have. If you have any other folders here where you're using the Tailwind utility classes, please do make sure to add them. This is done. Next, we need to create an input.css. We can call it anything we want to add these main 3 Tailwind directives. So I would like to call it tailwind.css. And let me paste these 3 here. This will add our pre-flight styles and other things that are required. This is our input CSS file. And also your custom CSS file. So anything else you want to add, like in our previous installation, we customized a background and we added that here, right? Layer components, and then we added the background. You can do all of that here in this input CSS file. Let's go back. And now you need to start the Tailwind CLI build process. Before this, we need an output CSS file. This is the input. What about the output? We can add that into the layouts folder as well. So within the layouts, let's create another folder, CSS, and then styles.css. And in the index.html, it's important to link that. Otherwise, you'll be wondering why Tailwind is not working. And css/styles.css. For now, obviously this is blank, but the moment you build using Tailwind, it'll take this input CSS file and output actual CSS into styles.css that you can use along with your HTML. So let's do that now. Copy this and paste it here. So let's try and understand what this does. So npx, it executes using Tailwind CSS. The input file, that is -i is for the input flag, /src/input.css. That's not where we have our input file, input CSS. We have it directly in the root tailwind.css and outputs it into /dist. Again, that's not where we have it. We have it within the layouts css/styles.css, right? So make sure you get these paths correct depending on where you have these input and output files. And then you can add the watch file, which means as you make changes, Tailwind will keep looking for new utility classes and keep building it on its own, as in when you save the file, that is. So hit enter. It's rebuilding and it says it's done in 167 milliseconds. Now you see styles.css is not empty anymore. You have a bunch of styles that you need. So all of this that you see here, the button, input, opt group, all of these are part of the pre-flight, that is the base styles that Tailwind adds by default. And then you have your, let me scroll down some more. Yes, we have our W full, head screen, rounded. Yeah, these are the ones we added. Then BG gradient and so on. Right, and then followed by that we have, oh yes, so we don't yet have the typography plugin styles because we haven't included the typography plugin. First, let's look at what this looks like in the browser. So open with live server. And yes, so without the typography plugin, this is what it looks like. Let's again put this to the right side. This is perfect. Now we need to install the typography plugin. So let me stop this process and clear the screen, expand this a little more and say npm install Tailwind CSS /typography. So this installs the typography plugin for us. After that, we need to see how to include this in our configuration. So clear it again and then search for official plugins. Yes, here it is. You just need to copy this statement here, require Tailwind CSS / typography, and paste it here within tailwind.config.js. And now let's execute Tailwind CSS using npx tailwind CSS this statement. Yeah, build is done. Now you should be able to see the typography styles applied. Yes, they are. And even if you go to the styles.css, you should be able to see all these pros classes, right? Great. So we saw how to include a plugin, and I also told you how to add custom CSS here. If you want, we can just do it once. Layer components, and let's call it BG primary again. Using the apply directive, you can paste all of these styles and then replace them with BG primary. Save the file. And for some reason you don't have them. Oh yeah, because we didn't save this file. Great. So the gradient is back again, and we're already using all the arbitrary values. That works as well. There's just a couple of things we need to talk about more. One is we would further want to minify the styles.css, compress it further, and for that let's stop this process and add another flag. So everything remains the same. Change the watch to minify instead. Hit enter and you will see everything is compressed as much as possible. That's how you push to production. Now I know that every time if you have to type this entire command, it's quite huge. We can simplify this by going into our package.json file and adding some scripts. So you can change this, you can add a script, you can add a script dev and copy this, paste it here. So we're using this for development, and then add another script for production, which will be the same thing except we have minify, right? So now you can simply say npm run dev and it'll start watching your files. You're in the development mode, you can continue developing, adding new utility classes, it'll watch the files and so on. Stop the script when you want to stop the development, and then just say npm run prod. This will minify the styles and you're ready to push to production. Great. So now we go to our final way of installing Tailwind CSS, which is using PostCSS. Like I mentioned, you would need this only if you have to integrate with other build tools like Webpack and stuff. Otherwise, you're good to go with the Tailwind CLI way of installing. Let's try this out now. Let me create a new project again using Tailwind PostCSS. cd into Tailwind PostCSS, and then open this and Visual Studio Code. Once again, I create a new folder, layouts, create an index.html file within, and call it Tailwind PostCSS. And once again, for installing with PostCSS, you will need npm. You might already know that because if you're using build tools, then you must be using npm. So let me open up the terminal and then do npm init. I have the package.json file, and now let's go to the documentation. So the first thing you do is install Tailwind CSS, PostCSS, and auto prefixer. So let me paste that, but change this to PostCSS CLI because I don't have PostCSS CLI installed. This might take a while. Once done, you will see that you have all these three installed latest versions of each as dev dependencies, right? So the next step is to create the tailwind.config.js with this statement, the same as we saw before. But at the same time, I'd like to add a -p flag. What this does is it also creates the postcss.config file. If you have that, great. If you don't already, then include the -p flag. So it creates two files for you. Right? So you see it's created tailwind.config and postcss.config. The default values and here as well. Now let's go back and you will see that the step number 2 stays add Tailwind CSS and auto prefixer to your PostCSS config, since we generated this file using npx Tailwind CSS. We have this automatically done. So if you don't, then make sure to add Tailwind CSS and auto prefixer here. Great. Now the next thing to do is add the paths like we already discussed in the previous installation. Here again, let's go to tailwind.config.js and our path will be layouts/star.html. This is done. The same thing again, we create an input CSS or a custom CSS file. Once again, let me create it here and call it tailwind.css. This is our main CSS file. Copy this and paste it here. Once again, you can add your custom CSS here. Now, here in the documentation, it just says npm run dev because they're assuming that you're already using some build tool. If you're not, what you need to do is, for some reason, if you're using PostCSS but you don't have any script ready, then go to your package.json file, go to script, dev, and then say PostCSS. So we're using PostCSS and we're taking the input file tailwind.css. We don't need the -i flag here, and output it to, we don't have that yet, let's create it. Output it to /layouts/css. I know this is not the right path. You would ideally have CSS outside of layouts. Just ignore that for now. /styles.css, that's the output file. And you need the -w flag or the --watch flag for it to watch your files as you develop. But sometimes this may not work and you may need to add a tailwind mode equals watch. And let's just test in a while if that's working. So clear it and say npm, we have to add the CSS folder here and then styles.css, our output CSS file, and then include that in index.html, css/styles.css, and once again within the body, let me add the same content. Let's save this and say npm run dev. So looks like it's watching the files and looks like it did build something. Let's go to styles.css. Oh yes, it did. And the reason we're not seeing anything like done in 167 milliseconds is because by default it doesn't. We can have that as well. Let me stop this, go back to package.json and add another flag called verbose. Now let's try npm run dev, and yeah, so it's saying processing and finished. So it did finish and we have our styles here. Let's check in the browser if this is working. Open with live server, and Tailwind isn't installed or it's not working for some reason. Let's look at our styles.css and let's come to the end. We don't have any of our utility classes here. Oh, let's check our path because that's the only thing that could have gone wrong. Oh yeah, So this should be star.html. If you spotted this error before, then great. Now let's see, it's waiting for, yeah, it's done again. It finished in 137 milliseconds. And now, yes, we do have all those styles, and I'm sure it's working here as well. Great. Now, including the plugin is very similar to what we did using the CLI. So I'm not going to repeat that step, but let me go back. And let's talk about one more thing, that is, in case you're using Windows, this will throw an error. I'm not sure what the error is, but you will get an error. What you need to do is you can say set equals Tailwind mode watch and PostCSS. This should work for you, but even if this is not working, I recommend installing an npm package, cross-env. So this is how you do it. Npm install cross-env, and once you do that, of course do that as a dev dependency, and then on Windows as well, this will not throw any error. This is one thing. And what about the production script? You can add that as well. This will be slightly different. It will not be Tailwind mode watch. Instead, this will be node env production, and none of this. And this works. If you want to minify, you cannot add a minify flag here because we're using PostCSS. There's a way to do it. Let's go back to the documentation and check. In the documentation, let's search for minify, optimizing for production. Yes. And here, if we come down, yes, you will notice that you need to add this in your postcss.config.js to use cssnano to minify your CSS. So let's copy this line, and within the postcss.config.js at the end of the plugins list, add this, but this is not going to work. You need to add a process.env.node.env. Again, don't ask me why, because I have no idea. This is what works. And if you know npm and PostCSS and all of those, you can explain this better to me. Now let's also install the cssnano npm package using npm install -d cssnano. And yeah, once that's done, it will compress the styles.css using cssnano only if the node environment is set to production. That's what it means. And since in the package.json file for prod we have node env set to production, this works only for production. Great. So now let's do npm run prod, and if everything is set up correctly, this should work. Looks like it did. Let's look at the styles.css, and yes, we have everything minified. Great. Let's summarize what we just saw. We looked at 3 ways of including Tailwind CSS in your project. Number 1, using the CDN link, which is only for development purposes, but extremely quick because you can add a single line and you're good to go. The second option is using the Tailwind CLI, which is the next quick option if you're obviously wanting to go production. We saw how to customize, how to add configuration, and include a plugin as well. And the third option is quite similar to the CLI, where you have to install everything, but you will need PostCSS only if you have other build tools or some other framework. I hope you found this tutorial useful. Do share it ahead if you loved it. Thank you for watching. Hit a like and share this video ahead. If you enjoyed watching this, don't forget to subscribe below and turn on the notifications so you won't miss a single video from Tyrus.